We do have a ton to get through in this episode.
Common sense is finally prevailing.
There was controversy this month, Dave.
I'm not particularly excited by that.
Secrets and things on set.
I haven't told them anything.
I think this is just good times all round.
Every Doctor Who is liked by somebody, and that's a really good thing.
Davo, my doctor.
I know we disagree on this one.
First world problems, Dave.
I get why fans are asking those questions.
Oh gosh, that's actually quite a lot to talk about.
It doesn't compute.
It's the elephant in the room.
That's okay.
Fandom versus the BBC.
The cardinal sin.
Moving along.
Lunch.
G'day, I'm Rob.
And I'm Mike.
And yes, that's not Dave on the line this episode, but super sub and longtime friend of the podcast, Mike Solko, dialing in from sunny California. Hello, Mike. What's happening?
Oh, it's great to be back. First time since 2022. I double-checked before we started. Yeah, I'm just shopping possibly to find a new country to live in, so great to be here.
If you heard last Sunday's Gin and TARDIS, Dave talked at the end of that show about being knee-deep in real-life work and our federal elections imminent, so we thought this was a good episode for him to miss, and then rejoin the circus early-ish April with a list makers, and then we'll be heading towards hot takes for the new season, and we'll have our Father Time episode, the one we had promoted for this episode slot, on April 27. So a few tweaks to the schedule this month, but nothing too weird. Dave will return. Tonight, meanwhile, here with Mike, we have a great topic. We'll be looking at a lost story from season 23, Paradise 5, which was recreated as a Big Finish audio adventure back in 2010. Looking forward to that chat, Mike?
Yeah, absolutely. It's very interesting. I wasn't even aware that PJ Hammond, who created Sapphire and Steel, had written a Doctor Who proposed stories. So that was one that instantly stood out as something that would be worth going back and looking into.
Yeah, that was a new one on me too, and it's so embarrassing sometimes. You think, gosh, this was recorded in 2010. Where was I? How do I not know this?
Just the hundreds and hundreds of Big Finish, and even with the lost stories, there's several dozen at this point. So you have to kind of wonder sometimes when you look at the list, is this something that was actually in development, like the Ultimate Evil, or is this just a one-off story idea that got thrown out immediately that they're pulling from the slush pile?
Yeah, because there was certainly a script, which I guess we'll talk about when we get to it, but there was a script. It wasn't just, an idea.
Indeed. So, yeah, lots to discuss on that one, so we'll see.
Alrighty. Should we rip into some news?
Absolutely, let's do so.
All right, I'll kick us off. One of the most interesting things to happen this month, I think, is that RTD appeared on David Tennant Does a Podcast With, which I didn't even realise had returned as it had been gone so long I'd actually taken it off my podcatcher. Anyway, one of the things RTD spoke about, and which has caught some people's attention, is he started talking about a new showrunner. And it's interesting how this happened. Tennant was kind of teasing him about would he ever come back for a third time, and he could have answered that very simply. But instead, he started riffing on how there'll have to be a new showrunner one day as he's not getting any younger. And I thought, why would you start riffing on that? You've only just made some specials, 2 really short seasons, which were mostly filmed a long time ago, and now you're riffing on a new showrunner? It should be the last thing you're talking about. You know, if I was media training RTD, that's the last thing. Right up until the point where you actually say I'm leaving, you should be presenting this virile, bulletproof sort of I'm not going anywhere vibe.
Indeed, you know, and you almost wonder, maybe there is a disciple or a trainee out there, somebody he's mentoring and possibly considering having them take that role over.
Yeah, because I was going to say, to cut to the chase, I just wondered if he's laying some groundwork here. Maybe there is someone in the background, like you say, that he'll be off sooner rather than later, because if we get this season coming out and it becomes apparent that Ncuti has jettisoned, and later in the year we get War Between the Land and the Sea, there's certainly no Christmas episode in the can, could RTD now be in a sort of showrunner figurehead sort of role until someone maybe new is going to step into the role and do something for 2027, 2028? What do you think about that, Mike?
Oh no, he's going to be taking over the BBC video role where he's just overseeing releases and goodness gracious. No, I think that is a possibility that he could sort of be in that de facto sort of producer role where he is overseeing things, and maybe we get a special event here or there, but nothing really tangible. No ongoing series, or certainly nothing new. It would be more of an aside, I guess, like War Between Land and Sea or something like that, or, you know, a unit one-off. Maybe we'll someday get the Paul McGann miniseries that everybody has wanted to see for the last decade plus. But yeah, it's an interesting idea, and I could see it being very likely that there is a couple years of wilderness where he maybe does try to groom that new showrunner, and they try to redevelop things, maybe similar to what we saw back all the way in Classic Series 7 when Barry Letts and Terrence Dix took over. Not to say that it'd be Exile to Earth, but just that similar idea, like, let's go back to square one, let's take a look at the concept and see, are there any new ideas or new approaches we can bring to it?
Exactly. And elsewhere in the piece, he did talk about he really wanted to be involved with this new era of Doctor Who so he could deal with Disney and deal with the thousands of executives you've got to deal with when you're working with a streamer. It would make sense to me, what you're saying, that he might hang around just to be there, and maybe he'll be doing that sort of role still, dealing with the streamer, but maybe having a new showrunner stepping in. Yeah. That's possible.
Yeah, indeed. And there's constantly negotiation going on around both the classic series and I guess we'd call it the middle series, second wave Doctor Who. But, you know, the 2005 up through Jodie's run, it seems like those rights get renegotiated every 2 to 3 years, and it ends up on a different streamer. So there'll be some power plays involved with that, no doubt. And it'll be interesting to see where it lands next. I think currently it's on Max in the US, but, you know, it's changed houses so many times, and even now in the US, kind of a quick news item, most of the classic series is now available to watch for free on YouTube.
Is that right? Legally?
It is. Yeah, it's legal. It's not like a bootleg or anything. I believe it just says Doctor Who Classic or something like that is the channel name. If you search Doctor Who Classic, you'll find it if you're in the US. But yeah, there's a few stories missing. I believe a few of the Daleks stories. All of Trial of a Time Lord is missing, which of course is an affront to me personally. But yeah, a lot of the stories are up, and I think even a few of the animated stories are up. So for those folks in the US, or not that I would ever say use a VPN, but it is worth checking out if you're looking for classic stories and you don't have them handy.
Yeah, definitely. I've certainly not come across it, but then again, obviously I'm being blocked from it, so that's why.
Of course, you know, it's just one of those algorithm things, and then, you know, someday the algorithm randomly says you should watch Creature from the Pit, and you have to really weigh whether that's what you want to spend your time doing or not. So
that's Dave's worst nightmare.
I would be in the same boat, honestly. So not a top choice.
Very good. Have you got a news piece for us?
I do. We have a new trailer that dropped within the last few weeks for Series 2 or Season 2, whichever way you refer to it. Mm-hmm. And it's a very interesting trailer, lots of quick cuts. We do see a lot more of our new companion played by Varada Setu, and it's very interesting to see she's a nurse. And it seems like she does not want to go on these adventures, that she's sort of been hijacked along the way. It almost makes me feel back to that Ian and Barbara sort of thing, where she's asking the doctor to get her back home. And I'm curious why a modern doctor can't get her back home.
Yeah, that is a mystery. If I had to give it my best shot, there's a line in the trailer about reality being in danger. And I thought, ooh, if reality's in danger, maybe the TARDIS is finding it very hard to sort of navigate around, maybe, and that's why it's hard to get her home. Or this being modern Doctor Who. How about this, Mike? Varada's character is the most important person in the universe. And reality revolves around her. Just her. And so she's causing the interference. I mean, it's no less bonkers than some stories have been, and it's kind of on point for how modern companions are treated.
It's always that kind of fear that I think just about every companion, possibly except for Martha, has been that super kind of, you know, just they're the most important person in the universe, like you said.
Poor Martha.
And yeah, you know, poor Martha, who actually is one of the most competent and wonderful companions we've had.
Agreed.
But I think that there is that sort of idea that we need to have a mystery or something to solve. And we had that last year with Ruby Sunday. And touching final scene aside, it just really was a flat mystery.
Yeah.
You know, it wasn't much of a mystery, and it just really played out for the sake of having a mystery. You know, it's a lot of it, I feel, goes back to that idea that we did Bad Wolf in Series 1, and everybody still talks about Bad Wolf, so every season needs a Bad Wolf. And it's just not the case.
God, that whole, she's pointing at the sign. What does that mean? Well, she's pointing at it because she's hoping in this deserted street, someone is actually watching and someone will know that means name the baby after this. Oh my God. Mike, it was so silly.
It's really quite awful, and it's unfortunate because I think a lot of the stuff around adoption and found families was very nice. Yes. And I thought that when she actually does meet her mother again, it was a very nice moment. But just the mystery around it was a whole lot of to do about nothing. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, when you build something up, you have to pay it off.
Yes, absolutely.
So we do get that quick aside in the trailer where the doctor sees the character that she played in Boom, and name escapes me, but one of the military soldiers from that episode last season. Mundy, thank you. So we see Mundy on the screen, and there's that sort of why is fate tying us together sort of thing. And I hope that the answer is for no good reason and that we find out immediately. Don't drag it out, just, it is just circumstance or fate.
Yeah, I was thinking, I hope the doctor just quotes The Cure and says, I know who you remind me of, a girl I think I used to know. And then that's it. And we don't go there again.
I thought that was Got Ye featuring Kimbra.
Oh,
sorry.
Very good.
Sorry, no.
Well, that was someone I used to know, not just a girl.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So you mentioned also forces beyond our understanding or forces beyond reality. And one of the characters that we seem to see in the trailer is a giant spider.
Right.
So there's an African, a West African myth. It's also carried over to the Western civilization, Caribbean especially, of a god called Anansi. And Anansi is a god of wisdom, of stories, but also a trickster god. So a lot of the illusions are about weaving and things like that, threads of stories. But that will be very interesting to see is this a character who's potentially manipulating reality?
Oh, does this tie into when Shooty was first cast and they said, what kind of stories do you want? And he sort of said, sort of honouring his African heritage, that he'd like myth and folklore from that part of the world?
I think that it's very likely. There's a particular story. Yeah, there's a particular story called, and I know we're going to go over the titles in a few minutes, but it's called The Story in the Engine. And that makes me wonder, we've had some allusions over this last couple episodes or last season where the idea is this real? Is this really happening? Or is there more going on than we realize? There's a scene in the trailer where you see Bonnie Langford as Mel is back, and it seems like reality is just melting around her. And other moments where you see things pushing against reality. So I think that there's going to be a lot to do with the nature of story this season, and that sounds really fascinating. It sounds like there's a lot of potential, and I hope that it's not just RTD, but I hope that it's some of the other writers involved who get to play into that.
Right, okay. And I'm trying to remember my season 1 here. Am I misremembering? Or maybe it was even the specials. Is there someone still sitting above the toy maker in the pantheon? And could it be this spider then?
I believe there is. The question becomes, is the spider someone who would be at a higher plane or somebody who would be in an equivalent plane of the toy maker and some of those other similar characters? We still don't know who Mrs. Flood is, and perhaps that's our other big mystery of this season. She certainly seems like a character who knows more than it would be appropriate for a standard character to know in one of these situations. So is she another god type figure? Is she a Time Lord or Time Lady? Is just, there's so many questions around what role she's going to play. She is not the Ronnie. Please quit saying she's the Ronnie. If she is, it's terrible. But there's a lot of different things that she could potentially be. So is she the one who's at the top of the chain, or is there perhaps even another character, that we'll meet later in the season?
And I'm kind of surprised that there are no returning villains or monsters sort of highlighted, and I'm surprised by that in a sense that if they have a Dalek story up their sleeve, for example, now's the time, guys, to shoehorn that into a trailer, even if it's just a Dalek smashing through a wall and saying exterminate right at the very end of a clip. That would give fans a real, oh wow, that's something I can get behind sort of moment, because right now, the way I feel, and I don't think this is unique because I talk to people on social media all the time, is that I have very low expectations for the season, and I just hope we get a good episode or two. But if I saw a Dalek in the trailer, my interest would go up. how could it not? And of course, if they don't do a Dalek story or they don't do a Cyberman story and Ncuti is off, how incredible that his Doctor never faced either.
Indeed. We really didn't see any returning villains that I can remember in the first season, including any of Ncuti's specials, aside from his debut with the Celestial Toymaker or the Toymaker. So 2 full seasons with no returning villains, aside from Mrs. Flood, who was introduced last year. I think that would be really interesting, but I don't think it's the way to go. I would like to see, we have 8 stories, so let's see at least 1 or 2 maybe where we sneak something in. Daleks or Cybermen, of course, would be nice, but even something like the Zygons would be, a nice just throwback. And if this is Ncuti's last season, that would be extremely interesting. I'm sure Big Finish would be salivating, but that's probably still a few decades out before that would become a deal. So,
yeah,
I think the one possibility that could bear fruit is we see a scene where it looks like Kate Lethbridge Stewart is walking through some sort of dark underground secret prison type place, and we don't get a clear image of what is within those prison cells. So that could be something that pays off with a past villain. The other possibility is we have the Interstellar Song Contest, and if we don't get a Dalek contribution, I think that would be a real shame.
I'll take on both of those. First, the cells. Something wet sort of slaps against one of the windows, and I was reminded of Children of Earth.
Oh, that would be an interesting callback.
It wasn't quite the same because I don't think there was steam or smoke or whatever in the cell, but it just reminded me of that imagery. Yeah,
absolutely. I definitely remember that. That sort of, I don't want to say a comparison, but I kind of like that Independence Day sort of thing, where you've got the alien kind of obscured in smoke and containment, and yeah, that could be a possibility, and I think it would be a very interesting possibility as well.
Yeah, and that zany Eurovision-style episode, putting aside the Big Finish has already done it, that was probably the lightest moment in the trailer, which tended to be quite darker in tone, I thought, and I wondered if that was just a bit of a reaction to the way the first season was promoted, and they're hoping to get a better reaction from pop culture types if they go down this darker path. I think the damage might be done. The average pop culture type has already got an opinion on current Doctor Who now, but...
Yeah, I don't see a lot of new folks necessarily jumping on board, but if word of mouth is good, I could see it catching some streaming views maybe a year or 2 out. It's almost going to be one of those things where one of the stars is going to have to kick off big somewhere else and people come back to it to view it. So
yeah.
And I don't mean that, I don't mean to be super negative about it. It's just really the nature of streaming television at the moment is most series don't pick up viewers as they go. They tend to shed them, and then usually there's either a restart or a big kickoff of some sort that will bring people back in. And Doctor Who is so unique even within the greater TV landscape. This idea that it's been back since 20 years now.
Yeah.
That's just really stunning to know that a TV show has lasted that long in a modern environment. So, yeah, I do see that there is a darker view to this aside from the Eurovision type thing. I am kind of curious about how, I think it's Mr. Ring-a-Ding, the character that looks very like a 1930s, 1940s cartoon character.
Yeah.
I'm very curious because those cartoons could have some very sinister vibes. So
definitely.
It will be interesting to see how dark that episode goes, especially because that one is the one that's most likely, I think, to bring in a casual viewer, perhaps aside from Eurovision.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. I always thought when they anthropomorphized things like a milkshake or a thing of fries, I often found them looking quite creepy back in the 40s, 50s. I think in Greece, don't they have an advert when they're at the drive-in and there are things like that on the screen? I kind of think it's during the intermission.
There was definitely back in the past, there was some different, let's go to the kitchen and get ourselves some snacks, kind of, intermission songs, things like that. One that comes to mind for me is there's a song by the Squirrel Nut Zippers, a band from the 90s who did a lot of swing, big band, jazzy kind of music with a real dark edge. And it's called The Ghost of Stephen Foster. And it's a throwback to that Betty Boop style, but there's lots of that anthropomorphization. There's a lot of just creepy imagery. And there's also a video game I've not played called Cuphead.
I've heard of that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a human body with a cup, like an old teacup for a head. So and it's that similar sort of look with this, to where I'm sure that will be a reference point for a lot of younger viewers.
Definitely. Now, just before we get into our short topics, you did mention episode titles. We do know what they are now. They were released a week ago, actually. So do you want to talk through those? Are there any that stand out, or any of the writers interest you?
The one that stands out immediately is the Interstellar Song Contest, primarily because it's written by Juno Dawson. She's a book author who's also written for, I believe it was called Doctor Who Redacted, a web series there, or a podcast series that was out a few years back. For me, I know her having written a couple of Torchwood stories for audio that were very strong. One was extremely campy. It was basically Torchwood USA in the 70s, and it had a Charlie's Angels riff. Very Marmite episode. Very
sure.
Just some people did not appreciate the camp. And then she did another one for the ongoing Beyond series, and very touching, very human stories. So I think that she's a great choice to add to the roster, and I'm very excited to see what she brings to it. And then the other one that stands out is The Story and the Engine, and that one's written by Inua Ellams. And again, I believe that's going to be the one where we see the giant spider, and I don't want to assume too much, but just what I have seen so far looks very interesting there.
Yeah. One of my takeaways is just how these are named. They're named very basically, like The Well, Lucky Day, Wish World, Lux, and even the ones with slightly longer titles like The Robot Revolution, The Interstellar Song Contest. It's just like what it says on the box. This is surely a deliberate decision not to have flowery titles this time around, because they're all like this.
It's kind of interesting. There's always the early 80s Target test, which is, if you titled this Doctor Who in the Lux, Doctor Who in the Well, Doctor Who in the Lucky Day, some would pass the test, others maybe not quite so much.
Doctor Who and The Story and The Engine. How about that one?
There you go. So yeah, definitely not too many titles on this list that stand out and really pique your interest just on a title basis. So it'll be curious to see if they are as simple as they possibly sound. I mean, certainly Lucky Day could be a lot of things. Who knows?
Yeah, it could be a very unlucky day, and it's being ironic.
And one thing we haven't even discussed yet is, are any of these Dr. Light stories or companion Light stories?
I'm hoping not, because Shooty obviously had to do a few Dr. Lights because of his obligations in the first season. I want more Shooty, especially if this is his last go-round.
Agreed. With 8-episode seasons, I think one every other year is pretty reasonable, and I think Dot and Bubble was a very strong episode, but I would like to get as much Doctor and Companion as possible, unless there's some golden idea that's just unbelievable, and of course then we'll bring that in, but we'll see.
Alrighty, shall we move on to short topics?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, one of the big pieces of news that's come out, or at least big to certain aspects of fandom, is the annual Gallifrey One convention took place about 4 weeks ago from when we're recording. And they had a great con again. Guests like Catherine Tate, Jenna Coleman, Colin Baker, Sylvester McCoy. Stephen Moffat was there, just hanging out at the bar, talking with people. So, and it's really a huge con as far as scale goes, and they only have 2,500 to 3,500 guests most year, attendees, but there's usually about 30 or so different guests, being from the showrunner level down to whoever it was that played Ruby's mom in the latest episodes. So there's always kind of that mix of you get background characters all the way up to doctors and showrunners and such.
It's nothing like we have down here.
Yeah, and I know that you kind of have I know Sirens of Audio have put on some really great events. Everything I've heard has been very positive, but just given the distance, it's very hard to come up with the funding and enough attendees to find that balance where you can bring in lots of folks.
That's the big one, the attendees.
Yeah, and understandably, Gallifrey One has been bringing in people from around the world. I've met folks from pretty much every continent at the con. I was talking to a guy from Belgium who flew in for it. People do come in from around the world to attend this. And even for a lot of the folks who are involved in the show, they look forward to it, and they seem to really enjoy it because it manages to straddle a line of being a small convention and being intimate, but still having enough events and enough attendees to where there's a lot going on at any given time. Yeah. And indeed, for myself, it's when I went this year, it was a very classic Doctor Who con. I didn't see anybody new series related. I don't even know for sure if they were there.
Really?
I saw them off in the hallway, but it wasn't what piqued my interest. And that's not to in any way disrespect the folks who were involved. I mean, Jenna Coleman, Catherine Tate, tremendous. But I feel like I've also heard a lot from them. So my events that I went to were more geared towards classic Doctor Who. You can have a completely different experience than your friend who you just see in passing over the weekend, just that's what's really been neat about the show. And that kind of comes to the bit of news about it is that the folks who've been running it as a nonprofit for the last 35 years or so announced that 2028 is going to be the last year that they do Gallifrey One as a convention. Now, that's not going to be the end of February conventions in LA for Doctor Who. Showmasters who represent quite a few of the actors involved. They do the autographs, they do the photo opportunities, things like that. They've really worked as a partner with Gallifrey One for the last decade or so plus. They are going to be bringing a new convention in 2029. Okay. So the big question becomes at this point, and I don't say this from a point of doubt, I say this from a point of optimism, is it still going to have that feeling of friendship and camaraderie and just that it's a place you go to see your friends and do some Doctor Who stuff? Or is there that chance that it's going to become a little more commercialized than it has in the past? Because I've made dozens of friends. I can't go five minutes without bumping into somebody. And I mean that in the best way. I could probably go to the convention just as a hotel guest and hang out with friends and never even go to Doctor Who events. So wow. It's just wonderful knowing there's a place you can go that you have at least one thing in common with everybody there. Yeah. And you make different friends based off just T-shirts and what panel you're at, or they pass out little badge ribbons which have cute sayings on them and such. So there's so many ways to meet people and make friends. And just to see some of those friends grow, I know folks who are now writing for Big Finish, folks who got to interview Paul McGann on their podcast last week. Just these big things where it's like I'm getting to see these people grow and branch out and do these amazing things within and without a fandom. And so to me, it's a very special event. It's not just a Doctor Who event, and it's not like a commercial convention like a San Diego Comic-Con or such. So yeah. I'm going on at length here, so I'll just kind of stop there. But I'll say, but if you're listening and you've never had a chance to attend, and you do have a chance to attend over the next couple of years, it's certainly just a really magical weekend. And it really is just, you'll have a tremendous time.
Yeah, it's something I've always had at the back of my mind, but real life practicalities have often got in the way. My takeaway on this, Mike, is surely they can see what the show's strengths are and they'll try and continue them. What I think would be good is if there is this sort of slightly homemade feel to it, that they get a crew in who can be there from year to year, and they aren't big name type MCs or anything. It's not Felicia Day or someone like that, but just some regular type fans who can just sort of be there year to year. And when we still have a show called Supernova out here, which is a pop culture convention, it's very corporate, they would have the same hosts year to year, and they were just regular pop culture type fans doing it. And you really felt that the show was a bit homemade. You felt that the person on the stage talking to the star from Buffy was just like you, because it wasn't a celebrity type MC. So I think there are ways you can do this and still make it feel very homely and cozy and all of that. But will they do it? I have no idea.
Yeah, absolutely. And Gallifrey has had that sort of host for most of their panels throughout their tenure. It is fans who genuinely appreciate the product, and yes. It makes a lot of difference. I remember during the pandemic attending a virtual con, and it was a free thing. It was, of course, to sell autographs or, one-on-one chats with the guests. But the moderator kept referring to the actress as Nicola Bryant.
Ooh.
And finally, she just had to stop him and that's not how my name is pronounced. But It was just that thing where you just cringe a little bit. It's like, you have no idea who this person is. So.
I made a note here too before we move on to our main topic. I think it might have been the first time you came on the show, Mike, back in 2017, wow. March 5th. We talked about the galley that you went to that year. So if people have been interested in what you're talking about here in our conversation, dig into our archive, find the March 5th, 2017 episode, and it's Mike and I riffing about everything that happened at Galley One that year. And that's a cool episode still to look back on.
Wow, 2017. Okay.
Yeah, you've been around a while with us, Mike.
I have. Did some reviews, and in the past we talked about some Doctor Who lost stories, so here we are again.
Yeah, it's good fun. Dave doesn't go away often, and when he goes away, I've got one slot, and I know about 50 people I could call on, but it's good when we can get you on.
I appreciate it.
Let's move on to the main topic. We've already given a bit of a preamble to this. 2010's Paradise 5 is the fifth story in the first series of Lost Stories produced by Big Finish. It was adapted by Andy Lane from the original script by PJ Hammond, who you mentioned earlier, Mike. PJ Hammond, of course, is a legend in British TV, having written for many, many shows over the years, but is probably best known as the creator of Sapphire and Steel, and that's what you were talking about earlier.
Yeah, that's certainly what I would know him from. I don't know that Sapphire and Steel has ever had any sort of televised release over here in the US, but in the early 2000s there were ways, and I haven't seen a whole lot of the series, but I've seen enough to know it's very odd and very creepy. So those are the sort of vibes I was coming into this story with, expecting something that was going to be maybe a little off the wall, a little cold, and not necessarily what we got here.
No. Should we read a bit of a synopsis on this, Mike, just to get people in? It won't be one of our patented long synopses that we do here on the show, but just a quick one. Why don't we do that?
Yeah, here we go. So the Doctor and Perry visit the planet Targos Delta in the 35th century to check in on Doctor's old friend, Professor Albrecht Thompson. It seems the professor left 3 months prior for a vacation at a highly exclusive space station resort called Paradise 5, but he failed to return as scheduled. The Doctor crafts a false identity for Perry so she can become a hostess at the Paradise 5 resort, while he intends to skulk about in the background and investigate.
Upon arriving, Perry is greeted by Paradise 5's head, Gabriel, who gives her a tour of the facilities. We learn there is a 1-to-1 ratio of staff to guest. There is a mustier backstage area where maintenance occurs, and a group of small, dim humanoids called cherubs keeping things running behind the scenes. As Perry acclimates to her new role and the Doctor investigates backstage, it quickly becomes clear guests are arriving but not departing. How does this tie into the mysterious Paradise machine? Are the cherubs brighter than they seem? And why is the Doctor warned, beware of the Elohim?
Yeah, so it's very interesting what's going on with this story. This was originally scheduled to be a part of season 23, which would have been part of the trial season. Originally, it was scheduled to feature Mel, and it would have been her debut story.
Yes.
And I know Bonnie Langford had done Big Finish prior to this, but I think this was an era where she was maybe busy with other work, which is part of why it was recrafted to involve Perry. And I know they said just for practicality reasons, to make it stand on its own, they kind of eliminated all the trial stuff and just made it a standalone story for the Doctor and Perry prior to all the trial nonsense. So there's definitely some similarities here to Mel's first story, Terror of the Vervoids by Pip and Jane Baker, which is on a cruise ship, which kind of has those resort type vibes to it. It's there's definitely some similarities there, mysteries going on and such. So I'm sort of curious if Eric Sayward or John Nathan Turner had a very specific brief for the folks writing that third story of the year as far as what they were looking for.
Yeah, a couple of things to say to that. One of the big challenges, and you've highlighted it, is that this would have had all the trial scenes in the original script. So Andy Lane had to strip that stuff out and insert new stuff. In terms of how much of this is actually still PJ Hammond, Andy Lane says on the Making of Doco that episode 1 is basically all him. It's all new. Episode 2, however, is pretty much all PJ Hammond. Episode 3 is Lane riffing on PJ's original plot, so a bit of a mix. And then episode 4 is kind of Lane diverging again into new territory because he felt the original idea was a bit old-fashioned, and I don't think this is spoilers to say, it was just going to be, oh, there is a race that's enslaving people. The end. So he wanted to make the ending a bit more unusual, and there were bits in the script that were already there that he could pick up on and make something new from it, and apparently PJ Hammond was quite delighted. So that's all quite interesting. But my question for you, Mike, is would you have rathered Bonnie Langford was in this so that even though we strip out the trial bits, it does still feel like a debut Mel story?
I don't think this would have worked as a first story for Mel.
Okay.
I think that there's something about the story that works very well for Perry, and that's that whether it be what the Doctor delegates to her or what she's asked to do by her superiors at Paradise 5, she's very put upon in this story. Thankfully not in a creepy, lusty way like usual for the most part, but she is kind of dumped on in a way that's just sort of, unfortunately, that's poor Perry. I think Mel would have just been very on board with it and shiny and happy with everything that happens, even if it's kind of not the best thing. So, she certainly would have been outraged towards the end, but I don't think that feeling of sort of being put upon would have been as present if you had Mel in this role.
Yeah, that's fair. The story grabs you very fast, I find. There's a very traditional open with lots of exposition in the TARDIS. There's lots of hearkening back to the past. There's a line about all we're doing is visiting people you know, which seems to be a commentary on some of the Colin Baker stories from this first season. There's a reference to Gumball Jack. There's some super 80s incidental music, which sadly isn't used enough in this. And I think if you're in the headspace to be back in 1986, this starts off really well.
Oh, absolutely. I think as far as the missing Colin stories I've heard goes, this is a much more pedestrian, middle-of-the-road type story, and I don't say that as a bad thing. It's not as dark or as violent as a lot of his other tales are. Not to say that there's not moments of darkness and violence, but it's not Mission to Magnus or, some of those other things where it's just kind of a miserable reading experience. The Ultimate Evil by Wally Dally. Those are stories where you kind of almost feel thankful that season 23 didn't happen as planned. Did I love this story? No. Did I appreciate it? I did. Mm-hmm. So I think that there was plenty that was good about it, and maybe some stuff that really was just disappointing or could have been developed further given a chance.
Yeah, well, look, without burying the lead, because we're still near the top of the review, I did like it. I think there's enough going on to be of interest. And like I said earlier, the way it's a genuine lost story should grab many fans' attention. And I say genuine as it isn't one of those big Finish lost stories that are based off someone, oh yeah, I think we were going to do this. And then they take one tiny little line or idea and they create a whole new story about it in the modern era. There were actual scripts from this, as I say, that Andy Lane worked from. One of the episodes is almost all PJ Hammond, and they were written back in the 80s. And I value that a great deal when it comes to a lost story. It makes it just feel a bit more real to me, even if they have changed things like put Perry in it, stripped out the trial, all of that. I liked this.
Now, is this a story you could see being televised?
Well, I made some notes on that. There are some things I don't think would be in the original or which would be harder to do on television. I'll start by saying I think the cherubs would be hard to do. In fact, if they tried to do them with children or little people back in the 80s, I think this could have been pretty disastrous. So I'm not quite sure what their intention there would have been.
It's fascinating because this is post Return of the Jedi. Mm-hmm. We should know better at this point. It's not to say that the idea is completely horrible, but it was something that, agreed, I'm just not sure how it would have played out on screen. The cherubs were one of the parts for me that was most frustrating with this audio, because so much of it is their kind of like jump, 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 jump language. Excuse me, sorry, but
you almost went into a yup Ewok.
Yeah, but it's that it's that really just cloying, especially when you get several of them speaking at the same time, sort of thing. Because in audio, you either have to explain what you're doing or do some sort of verbalization that shows you're active in some way.
Yeah.
So we get a lot of that, and it doesn't necessarily translate to what they're doing, and it really kind of at times is very frustrating from an audio perspective.
Definitely.
I think it would have worked better possibly televised, but I'm still not sure it would have been the right way to go.
Yeah, that's fair. Continuing with these notes, the gay relationship I don't think would have flown to the same degree. We might have had those two characters. We might have even got a deer heart between them once or twice. But I think the 2010 audio gives us more freedom than a 1986 children's television show.
Absolutely. I don't know how much was necessarily there originally. I don't think that JNT would have been likely to let it through.
Yeah.
I think he would have probably squashed it or asked it to be toned down severely. But I thought that having a gay relationship between the two main villains was a refreshing change of pace.
Yeah.
I like the way they played it, that Alex McQueen's character was very verbose and very eloquent. I think they even refer to that in the script, that he's a very talky kind of guy, much like Colin is. And then you have James Darcy as the more kind of blunt instrument sort of guy behind the scenes monitoring things, and certainly the one, if somebody has to be the strong arm of the two, he's the one more likely to do so.
Yeah, and I've known couples like that in my life, and I'm like, I know these two. I know exactly this dynamic. Yeah. There's meta stuff, like referencing Perry in a bikini. And this one's interesting, Mike, because it seems from the making of that putting Perry in a bikini was all Andy Lane's idea, and you can tell he's really into it. And it'd probably have a producer at Big Finish in 2025 wanting to cancel him with the way he goes on. It was 15 years ago, folks.
Yeah, my eyes were definitely rolling at that comment, but then it is a bit of a joke as well, because of course you're putting Perry in a bikini in an audio play in which nobody can actually see her in a bikini. So there is some sort of meta commentary there, and his eagerness was a little goofy, but it was kind of a funny joke, because during that moment in the audio, I rolled my eyes and then proceeded to laugh, understanding the joke there.
Yeah, and it was very meta. I mean, we hear she's in a bikini, and then I think one of the guests tells her how good she looks in it, and at that moment I was like, uh-oh, and then Bryant sort of deadpans, oh, so I've been told. And she doesn't oversell it. She doesn't sell it as, see, that was a joke. Oh, so I've been told, She does it so straight. It's like, oh, that was perfect. That works.
Yeah. I really love Nicola's performance in this story. I think she does a tremendous job. And I did appreciate that there was very little of the typical lusting after Perry we get most of these stories. So you got the joke. But aside from that, it was relatively tame.
Yeah. Now, before we talk about the cast, I do have one more point in this little section I made of things I don't think would have been in the original. I'm not even sure the joke about the Doctor repeating things but using Greek or Latin to make them sound fancy would have flown back in the 80s. The show did jokes, of course, but again, it's that kind of meta, let's take the piss out of ourselves thing. I don't think that would have flown. It's not until we get something like Curse of Fatal Death and suddenly it becomes a bit of a wink at the audience from writers like, yes, we know this is silly or it's cheesy or we know we do this trope all the time, but it's okay. We're in on the jokes. Sit back, relax, enjoy yourselves. That sort of becomes a thing in Doctor Who. I'm not sure it would have been a thing in a 1986 episode, though.
No, not from a Perry perspective. I could see Mel getting away with the line, but not Perry so much. But definitely understanding, I don't know how much JNT or Sayward would go for that. It's a little too on the nose, and even though it's a great line and one of those really funny moments that just, if you're familiar with a lot of Colin stories, it's just dead on perfect.
Yeah. Well, speaking of Colin, do you want to lead us off on the performances in this with Colin?
Yeah, I think that this was an interesting one in that the first half of the story really was almost a Colin Light episode. Much of his adventure is spent in the background. It's more about Perry being the one extremely active and interacting with characters and such, whereas the Doctor maybe runs into one or two folks in the backstage area of the resort, but most of his is just kind of skulking around and trying to creep out what's happening here. I thought it was a good Colin story. I appreciate that he wasn't so acidic slick. He seemed to genuinely care for Perry. There is one plot point that I'll probably come back to a little later in the story, as far as where I was a little frustrated, but that's related more to the writing, I think, than the performance itself. So yeah, I greatly appreciated what Colin did here, and Nicola as well. Like I said, I think was really strong here. I think she got a lot to do. It wasn't a typical companion running around getting captured, getting interrogated kind of thing. So I think she really stood out as probably one of the strongest players here.
Well, Nicola fares well, I think, because it's not the stammery, overdone American accent of the TV years, and it's a much more confident performance, which still remains 100% Perry at the same time. I don't want listeners to think, oh, well, does she not sound like Perry? Yeah, she absolutely sounds like Perry. It just feels different, but not in a distracting way.
Yeah, this is very much Trial of a Time Lord to Perry. This is not season 22 Perry. Exactly. And that makes a huge difference. Yeah. Part of that is in the writing, part of it is in the performances, and just those sorts of quips like we talked about. This is a doctor and a companion who actually want to be hanging out together, not who are just putting up with each other for the time being.
Exactly. And Colin, I must say, is really good in this story. And I just want to quickly flag that it's Colin sounding like Colin. You know, just as Tom's voice has gone off, Tom Baker's voice has gone off in recent years, so has Colin's. But the difference is Tom's had already changed by the time he got to Big Finish. Colin has a period at Big Finish where you can't discern a real difference between his performance and what you would have got circa 1986. And at this stage, he still has that voice. So it's so easy to sit there and just imagine this being in season 23 as he sounds spot on.
Agreed, absolutely. I think that this really nails the feeling, and it kind of goes back to something you even mentioned where there was that scene, or well, really a series of scenes at the start where it felt very of this era, in that they start out in the TARDIS and he's fiddling with the TARDIS and Perry's taking shots, and and then they start investigating kind of on their own. They don't just immediately get integrated into the story in the way that a lot of other doctors would. That's very much of the era, and it gives a chance for that relationship to build and show some positive moments.
Exactly. Finally, Alex McQueen as Gabriel is probably the only other character I'd really pull out on his own to mention. I think he performs this really well. He's got a very distinctive voice. He's a very slimy yet also sort of world-weary character that voice pairs well with. I think it really hits the spot here, and it doesn't surprise me at all to learn that he's played the Master in some Big Finish as well. I think he's got a great voice for it.
Absolutely. I see very much why he came up in their mind as soon as they were going to recast the Master a few years later. And those stories I've heard with him, both with Sylvester McCoy and with Paul McGann, he does a really fantastic job. It's a very slick Master. It's a very cruel Master, but at the same time, it manages to walk a fine line between being outrageous without being ridiculous. Very good fit there. I actually want to go back and watch The Thick of It. I didn't realize he was a recurring character in that show, and I've never really given that show much of a try, so I need to give that a shot as well.
Yeah, that's a great show. One of Dave's faves as well. If Alternate Galaxies wasn't just sci-fi and fantasy, I'm sure we would have done a Thick of It Alternate Galaxies by now.
Well, they talk about Star Wars Legos, as we all know. So
maybe we can use that. Yeah, okay. That's our lead in. Okay.
A couple notes. The first question I would have, and I'll throw this to you, is: should the guests have had more personality? Or did they have enough personality to serve the role that they were guests on this resort, and that we should feel concerned about them being in peril?
Yeah, that's interesting, because we sort of meet... There's one in particular, I can't think of his name offhand. We meet, Perry's chatting to him, and next minute he's gone. He's been erased. And it's like, oh, I didn't know whether I was meant to be really into that character or not. So he hadn't really fully grabbed me. I thought there was more to come, but then he was gone. The guests do sort of come and go in that way.
Yeah, and I understand with an audio play, you're very limited in terms of casting, and I know several people played multiple roles, understandably, but I think that was one of the points of frustration I did have with the story, is I just felt like a little more personality from one or two of the guests would have been nice. There was the gentleman you mentioned, and I did feel like he was going to be a larger player than he was. And I at least felt a little concerned when he passed, or whatever happened to him. And then there was a character later that was very rude and boorish. And of course, that was just a very kind of a stock character to put into a play like this. I did enjoy his scenes with Colin, just sort of brushing him off and being happy to be done with him. But yeah, I guess maybe if there'd have been one or two more characters who had a hook to them or something that we really cared about what happened to them, I feel like we didn't get that. Even had maybe the staff had a little more personality, the staff who were not antagonists, I think that could have helped a little bit. There was a couple of twin characters who were around, and they were fine, but, there just wasn't a lot of hook there.
No, that's right. That scene, to rewind back to that first character where they say, oh, his room is empty, and Perry's like, well, I was talking to him here an hour or two ago. That can't be right. And the rest of the staff are just sort of brushing over it. That was kind of chilling, but we just hadn't got to know him well enough at that point to be fully invested in what had happened to him. I was reading a Warhammer book recently, and I know it's different in a book that's 300, 400, 500 pages long, but they introduced a character and you followed him through his time as a prisoner on this spaceship and then gets captured by the enemy, but the enemy start treating him nicely. And I thought, oh, this is a very interesting character. But then a couple of chapters later, he was ritually sacrificed. And I was truly shocked by that because I thought they were introducing a character who was going to be built up into something and he was just bumped off later. But I guess in the book, you had a much longer time to introduce this character and really get into his head. Whereas in these audios, that they are very short, even these 4-parters.
Oh, absolutely. And I know Andy Lane can write those sort of characters that engage you. I think back to the book Original Sin, there's a character named Homeless, Forsaken, Betrayed, and Alone. Quite a name, and it's stuck with me for 30 years now. And yeah. But just these characters that you do actually really develop this deep caring for, and when something happens to them, whether it be good or bad, you do feel affected by it. So I think that would be one of my notes if I was a story producer, would be to ask, could we beef up one or two of these characters a little bit? And I understand PJ Hammond, like we said, he'd done most of the script for what was used for a part 2, so maybe it would have to be a little bit later that would be the case, and maybe not. Regardless, just a little more meat on the bone there would have been nice. I think one other thing that was a little disappointing to me, and this is what I was mentioning prior as far as the Sixth Doctor goes, is he spends the 3rd episode just sort of waiting around to see what happens. When he knows that something is happening to the guests, and he knows that they're being called one at a time and they're not being seen again. But he just sort of contently sits there and eats his gumbo jack, despite being a vegetarian at this point, which also...
good point.
You made a continuity reference and you blew it, Andy. So, or PJ, I shouldn't say, but I actually did look that up. That I guess there was a comic strip that said he wasn't a vegetarian. So, okay, fair enough.
Maybe he's a pescatarian.
There you go. So, but I did have to laugh as soon as they kept referencing Gumbo Jack. I just was like, he's a vegetarian now. You missed the point. Yeah. Anyway, sorry, that was not my point here. But just basically that the Doctor is passively sitting there while people are obviously being killed or taken away or whatever is happening. So I thought that was a very disappointing note for the Doctor.
Yeah, he's sort of, a bit inactive there, yeah.
Some doctors that might work, but the 6th Doctor would be banging on doors and shouting and hollering. So not something that broke the story, but was a little frustrating to me during the listening. And one other thing I'll bring up, and maybe this is a good skip ahead 3 minutes kind of thing if you're listening and don't want the ending spoiled. But we do find out that this is all taking place with souls being harvested to fight a battle on another plane with beings beyond reality. And it was an interesting idea, and I'm very interested to hear that seems more of an Andy Lane idea than a PJ Hammond, because it sounds like a Hammond sort of idea. But the problem to me also is when you introduce this idea of a war beyond heaven, or whatever you want to call it, everything that's happened before feels like small stakes now.
Yeah, it gets very big, very fast, but it's right at the very end, and it's all very rushed. Like even when the Doctor is in the machine with the other guy, it doesn't feel like he's in there any time before Perry pulls the plug and he's out and everything's resolved.
Yeah.
And it's like, we just got to this big concept and now we're sort of yanked out of it, almost literally.
Yeah. You know, you've got this story where people's souls are being harvested, that their physical bodies are now reduced to shrunken beings, things like that. You basically have Lawrence Miles writing the movie Phantasm.
Is that right? I've not seen it.
Oh, goodness. Phantasm is an experience. I won't say any more. Just if you ever want to kind of just laugh at a very interesting 70s horror film that is equal parts scary, confusing, and just ridiculous, it's a fun one to watch. But there are similarities between this story and that. So I was so invested in this idea that this sounds really interesting. I want to see more of this war. I want to see why these are the people being selected to fight this war and so on, that unfortunately there was no time to develop that idea.
Maybe without the 4-episode constraint and trying to make it like an actual story from the 80s, maybe they could have turned it into something more like that if they didn't have to start off with a TARDIS scene at the start and make it feel very episodic. Do you think that might be the case?
Oh, absolutely. I think if this was a new adventure novel or, you know, something that he adapted into a book form, I think the entire third act would have been working with that. Probably the Doctor and possibly Perry as well, both spending the majority of that third act in this alternate realm. I think there would have been a lot more time to develop it, stylize it, and even the budgetary constraints of audio wouldn't be a restriction given that case.
Yeah, true.
So I don't mean to sound so negative. I think there's a lot of fascinating ideas here. I just wish a little more time could have been spent maybe developing them or just reshaping them in a way that maybe played a little bit more clearly.
Yeah, which leads us to whether people should listen to this. Mike, I'll lead off. I think this is an interesting one to recommend to people because on the face of things, it's not a melt-your-face, incredible, I can't believe how good that was kind of story by any stretch of the imagination. It's just not. But if you're in the mood for hearing Colin and Nicola sounding really good in a story that feels authentic to the era, and with that added knowledge that a good chunk of this could have been in season 23 instead of Vervoids, I think this is a very worthwhile listen. It's certainly not a dog of a story. You don't have to slog through it wondering when it's going to be over. So yes, I think people should listen to it, as the pros, such as they are, outweigh the cons, or really just the one con that it's not a massive life-changing event. It's just a decent little story.
And not every story needs to be Blink or, you know, or The Day of the Doctor. It's nice to have stories that are more just evenly paced and just sort of, hey, here's an adventure we had, no huge changes to the characters, but still it's just an interesting adventure with some interesting ideas. You know, I noted that there was some similarities on a very vague level or very, very loose level to Terror of the Vervoids, but it's an incredibly different story than Terror of the Vervoids. So I really enjoy what they did here. I think the other thing I just kind of thought of, and sorry, this is taking us off course again, but just I'm very curious how it would have played as part of the trial, or what the Valeyard would be trying to accuse the Doctor of, or what the Doctor would be saying he saved here. But yeah, it's a fascinating story, and I think if you're a fan of Colin and Nicola, it's something that you absolutely want to listen to. And even if you're curious to hear the Sixth Doctor and Perry in a story that they're not adversarial and at each other's throats and just being really miserable, this is the kind of thing that people talk about with Big Finish, of how Big Finish has redeemed the Sixth Doctor. So even a somewhat decent story feels so refreshing and wonderful compared to much of what we got on television.
Yeah, well said, well said. Well, that wraps it up for Paradise 5. If you're out there and you've heard it, write in, let us know what you thought of it. If you've not heard of it, what did you think of our chat about it? Let us know your thoughts. Now, moving on, listener feedback. We've got a ton of it this month, Mike. I'm going to rope you in to read some of it. I've got Jeremy Power via X. He says, "Hi, Rob and Dave. Hope you're doing well. I've been really enjoying the podcast, and I know you've mentioned Red Dwarf in passing before. This got me thinking, would you ever consider doing an alternate galaxies episode on Red Dwarf? I know plenty of Doctor Who fans, myself included, who love the show, and it would be really interesting to hear your thoughts on just how revolutionary revolutionary it was at the time. It could also be fun to discuss how humour and comedy have evolved since then. Laugh tracks have disappeared from modern shows since The Office. Just a thought. Keep up the awesome work. And I'll jump in and say I replied to Jeremy when he sent this in. And I said, look, I've talked to Dave before about doing a Red Dwarf Alternate Galaxies. And Dave, sort of similar to me, knows the first chunk of Red Dwarf really, really well. Seen it a million times. The latter series, not so much. So we'd have to do an Alternate Galaxies that's just on the earlier stuff, not the latter stuff, because I don't think either of us have seen the latter stuff enough to really comment on it properly. But it sort of is still in the mix for Alternate Galaxies, maybe one day if we don't have anything up our sleeves. Mike, do you like Red Dwarf?
I'm in a similar boat. I've seen perhaps the first 2 seasons. I enjoyed it, and it's something I really should seek out and watch more of because people whose opinion I respect really love it. I know it goes off in some really different directions along the way, yep. And it does feel daunting. It's one of those things where I understand how people feel about Doctor Who from the outside. It's just there's so much of it at this point. Do I have to watch everything? Are there certain parts I should watch and so on? So I think the idea of maybe doing a alternate galaxies on the first few seasons might be a good idea. And then depending on what you're interested in, maybe down the line, continue with it. There's so much television, both historical and new. It's really hard sometimes to fit in everything you'd like to watch.
Yeah, well, I own all of Red Dwarf on disc, even the new stuff. And when I see it sitting there on the shelf, I think, will I start a rewatch of that? Oh, God, no. No. There's so many boxes up there, and I know they've got about half a dozen discs in each. Oh, no. Yeah. Anyway, take us on to Chris Marsh.
Okay, well, Chris Marsh via email has another alternate galaxies idea for us. He recommends The Flip Side of Dominic Hyde and Another Flip for Dominic.
Yes, which I had to look up. I forwarded this to Dave. I said, have you ever heard of this? He's like, no, I've never heard of this. They're apparently 2 slightly sci-fi related British TV movies from the early 80s, which neither of us know anything about. So it bears investigation, maybe not for an Alternate Galaxies, but just myself and Dave, and hey, anyone listening to this, go out there and find these, because Chris thinks they're worth doing an Alternate Galaxies on, and we'll certainly have a look at them. I can't guarantee an Alternate Galaxies in the near future, though.
Indeed, that's something I will check out on YouTube and just see what kind of clips are out there and just see if it's something that looks of interest to me and to find out if it's even available in the US or not. So it's always curious to hear about these asides that people love deeply that you've never heard of.
Exactly. There's always so much more stuff. It's incredible. Martin notes via X on the Extended Universe Stories episode of The List Makers. Martin says, even though I didn't recognise most of the Extended Universe suggestions, an enjoyable listen nonetheless. Agree it would make sense to mine some of these stories for TV.
I think there's so much good source material out there, and I think we're far enough removed from the new adventures, the EDAs, and the different past Doctor adventures and such, as well as Big Finish, that whether you're giving, some sort of story credit or what have you to the original authors, I think there's just a lot of stuff that would make for really solid storytelling. And as Human Nature, Family of Blood showed us, there's also plenty of possibility to tweak it or revamp it in a way that it's still going to feel fairly new to the people who enjoy that original story.
Oh, absolutely. And just on a side street to this, I still wish animation was a lot easier and cheaper and they could take Big Finish stories where they've already got all of the audio and all of the dialogue and just animate them. I think some of them would be amazing.
I really hope Ian Levine isn't listening right now.
Oh. Okay, I'll shut up.
I said it. That's on me. So.
Who have we got next?
Okay. Next we have James Felder, who writes via email with the suggestion for the Hat of Rassilon. Hi, I'm a listener from USA, New York. I can't do a New York accent, so I'm not going to insult you, James.
Whenever I try to do one, I end up in Boston, so I won't try either.
Been watching Doctor Who since I was a kid in the 1970s. Love the podcasts. I have a suggestion for a list subject. A favorite game of mine. James, this is a favorite game of mine too. When I saw this email on the list, I lit up.
Oh.
James recommends pick 5 doctors. Pair them with a companion not of their era whom you think they would make a good partner to. All the best, James.
Oh gosh, that is solid. I hope that comes out of the hat. I'm sure Dave's thrown it in.
Oh, it's such a great idea. So I am a huge insomniac. I struggle to fall asleep. My brain likes to go 18 directions at once. So this is a game I've played where I try to match all 15 doctors to a different companion with the idea that there's no duplication. And you end up with some really fun ideas, like the Fifth Doctor with Liz Shaw would be some really fantastic, mature stories. My personal favorite is the Fourth Doctor with Vicky, and ideally a male companion for them to dunk on the whole time. I think those two would be thick as thieves, and I think they'd be wonderful. And then you end up with some ideas that could be really goofy and silly. Like you could almost flip it and do which ones would be a disaster, such as the First Doctor and Mel.
First Doctor and Ace.
First Doctor and a lot of companions, I think, would fit the bill. But it is, James, I love this. I also hope it goes into the Hat of Rassilon, and I can tell you that I will be submitting my ideas if it does. So great email, great feedback. Thank you.
Nice. Now for some comments on our Hitchhiker's Guide episode of Alternate Galaxies. The first one is from, Michael Solko, soon to be formerly of the Doctor Who show after this email. He writes, "Hello lads. I find myself deeply enraged that your Alternate Galaxies discussion of Hitchhiker's Guide focused on the TV series rather than the books or radio plays. I first encountered the books in 7th grade, then soon after found a book on tape of the first radio production at my local library. Comparing TV's Ford Prefect to the radio version is like comparing Matt Smith's Doctor to Peter Davison's Doctor." Mike, kidding aside, I highly recommend giving the audio series a try. It's more accessible than ever and serves as a fun, complete 6-part trilogy. Thank you, Mike, for your email. And for once, the person who wrote the email is actually here with me. Mike.
Yeah. So it's a little tough for me because the TV show is the last thing I came to, I guess, aside from the recent theatrical film. So for me, it just felt extremely jarring. And the performances of Ford Prefect, I remember somebody saying he had this sort of manic energy, and no, Ford is a very dry character. So it just was one of those things where it's like you hear somebody talking about it and it's like, yes, you're right, but no, you're wrong completely. So this is part of what's wonderful about fandom at Doctor Who and all these different things we're a fan of, is that there are different interpretations and that there's different avenues. And it's wonderful to me that something as broad as Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy has reached so many people in so many different ways. And yeah, just if you've never heard the audio series, I just tremendously give a huge recommendation to it, especially the last few years, the 5th set and the 6th set. It develops quite a bit from the original series, just in terms of production value and the way it's presented. So yeah, just if you've got some spare Audible credits or whatever service you use, just give it a listen and see what you think.
Well, you know what I did after that episode? Dylan on the episode was saying one thing he was surprised by is how he's always just been a TV guy with this, and he's never read the books. Whereas I sit there and I think, well, yeah, I read the books when I was much younger. I've watched the TV many times. But one thing I've never done is done the audio books. And I went onto Audible, and the audio book, so we're not talking the radio here, folks. I'm talking about the audio books. The first one is read by Stephen Fry, and I thought, okay, fine. But then the other 4 are read by Martin Freeman. And I thought, oh, no, this won't do at all, because I'll get used to Fry reading it, then Freeman's reading it. I'm not sure I want Freeman to read it. And then I quickly learned Douglas Adams narrated all of them, and those versions aren't on Audible. So I jumped on eBay, and a lot of these CDs now are very, very expensive, but someone was selling all 5 of them for $80 Australian. And I thought, I'll have that, because some people are selling just the first Hitchhiker's book read by Douglas Adams for over $100 on its own.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, I got all 5 for 80, or in US money, probably about 60. And so they've arrived now, and so I've got all of those. And I have very fond memories of having Dirk Gently read on tape by Douglas Adams when I was a kid. So I know Douglas Adams can narrate, and it just tickles me that I now have all 5 Hitchhiker's books, and Douglas Adams is going to read them to me in the very near future.
That's really cool to hear. And I'm going to have to see what I can do to track those down or check them out, because that's another one I have not heard. And I think hearing it in his voice would just have that extra special feeling to it. It's sort of like Andrew Cartmel has been doing his own books these last few years, The Vinyl Detective and The Paperback Detective, I think. And the narrator that they hired to do those books is very excellent. But you have Andrew Cartmel right there. And if you've ever listened to the man, it's like he should be narrating his own books. So so it's just kind of one of those things where it's like I read them as is. I don't listen to them. But yeah, just I understand how sometimes having the author can really be the way to go.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, we have next Glenn Hewitt via Facebook says, another fantastic episode as always. You did an amazing job at doing an overview of the 6 episodes. I've always been a fan of the BBC TV show ever since I saw it way back when. I didn't realize it was 1983 when it aired on the ABC. For some reason, I thought it was 1982. Parentheses, the memory cheats. Am I right in remembering the show went out on a Thursday night? I've only ever read the first 2 books, and I've never gotten around to making a proper attempt on the others, despite owning them. I've listened to some of the radio shows, but my heart will always belong to the TV show. When I think of Richard Vernon, I think of Goldfinger and A Hard Day's Night.
Nice. To answer that question about Thursday nights, I have no idea. If you've heard our episode, I don't know whether I was shown this live or on VHS back in 83, so I don't know what night it went out, but it's possible. I think it would have been a more adult sort of slot after the news and all of that on the ABC. Yeah, that's my takeaway from that email.
Yeah. I'm not familiar with what was going on at that time, of course, over on your side of the world, but
no.
But it is, it's kind of an interesting one, and I think it goes into the next email we'll hear in a moment as well, but it's just sort of an interesting thing is that it's very much on a Doctor Who budget. Yeah. So I would be very curious to hear what adults at the time thought of it, as far as did they look at it as more of a kiddie show like a Doctor Who, or did they view it as something which had similar visual style but was more of an adult product?
Yeah. Well, when I think of the ABC back in the 80s, they would show a lot of British stuff, and there was that alternate sort of comedy. I mean, something like The Young Ones came later than when they were making Hitchhikers, but in that sort of area, the ABC would be showing counterculture, alternate comedy type stuff. So I think there was an audience for it, watching the ABC in the early to mid to late 80s. It's an interesting time to look back on. I wish I had been just slightly older. My brother was, so he'll remember.
Yeah, there you go.
Dylan Mooney via YouTube says, great discussion. I am currently 21. Oh, God, I'd love to be 21. And discovered the show as a 19-year-old university undergraduate. I can definitely see it being a hit among my age group. Maybe adopt a slightly risque approach.
So I'm curious, because there's definitely some tonal stuff or some jokes that are a little risque, but they don't really go too far. I can see with a character like Zaphod Beeblebrox, so you could go very far with that.
Yes.
So I think you'd have to really walk a thin line as far as what's risque within the tone of the original works and maybe what's a little too far.
Yeah, well said.
Okay, well, Marcus Jameson via Blue Sky says, so glad you chose the best version to talk about. Really, Marcus? I've been a huge fan since first hearing the BBC radio series as a kid, and I loved the TV series, but I couldn't finish watching the film version. I have not seen the film version either, Marcus. I've only seen a few minutes. It seemed fine, but it just didn't necessarily seem like something I needed to spend 2 hours on.
That really surprises me, Mike, because it's been out for so long now. I thought maybe at the time you might feel that way, but it's been out for so long, surely you've had a wet weekend. One time in sunny California that you've thought, I'll just put it on. What harm can it do?
I've spent too much time watching horror films the last few years, so it just hasn't shown up on my radar. The clips I've seen seem fine. I just think it's maybe a little too different from the source material from what I have seen, to where I don't know if I would care for it. Perhaps being the total generic nerd guy, I'm going to say that I think Zooey Deschanel is actually a really great choice for Trillian.
Yes.
I think she really could potentially fit that middle ground of being able to be cool but also be nerdy. But yeah, I'm so married to the idea of Simon Jones as Arthur Dent. I really struggle with anybody playing that role aside from him.
Yeah, that's entirely fair. My biggest takeaway, because I had to go searching for some audio clips recently from it, and I was watching clips and I thought, without the sound, without thinking about it too much, visually this looks amazing. It looks like a Terry Gilliam film. There's all these practical effects and puppets and it looks amazing. But once you start listening to the audio and comparing it to the old stuff, and it's like, oh, no. This just doesn't work. Anyway, Doc Hume from the Diddly Dumb podcast says, "Gentlemen, enjoyed your Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy show. The weird and wonderful world of podcasting has brought us some truly weird things. But people who can only see Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy as a TV thing, this is beyond the pale. I'm at the opposite end of the spectrum in that I listened to it on BBC Radio on its original broadcast. I'm not sure if 11 going on 12 is the best age to appreciate it, but I bought the first 2 books as soon as they came out, so I must have enjoyed it. And I ordered the 2 LP albums of it and Restaurant by cutting out the mail order forms out of the back pages of the books. God, am I old." I think the LPs demonstrate a lot about what you were saying about coming to it as a TV series, because I always used to record new LPs onto audio cassettes as soon as I bought them, so I could put the pristine LPs away and wear out the tapes instead of scratching the LPs. I listened to these tapes so many times that I think I eventually forgot they were tapes of LPs and assumed I must have taped them off the radio. The BBC repeated the radio series many years later, and I struggled to cope with it. Someone paused for an extra half second there. Peter Jones put slightly less irony into that sentence than I remember. And of course the absence of Paddy Kingsland's glorious and far more adventurous radiophonic workshop soundtrack. The belting accompanying graphics for the book aside, I couldn't bear the TV series, and don't get me started on the film. Cheap TV can easily age and start to look of its time, but your imagination doesn't, so it's radio for me. I'm fairly sure that Australia had a big stage tradition, as the UK has, but does it also have a radio tradition? I know that at one time you were bringing over a ton of BBC TV shows, but was it the same with BBC radio? When I was in Queensland in 1988, I remember hearing a Hancock's Half Hour on the radio, but I don't know if that was a rarity. Does the ABC have its own radio network the way the BBC has? P.S. You're right, Sandra Dickinson wasn't the big thing Janet Fielding would claim. We used to see her occasionally on Give Us a Clue, and that was about it. All the best from Doc Hume. Well, Mike, before I let you rain down praise on someone not liking the TV series, I'll just say, yes, Doc, the ABC does have a radio network like the BBC has with multiple channels. Yes, we have similar stage traditions, but I think a radio tradition, like in terms of radio plays and things, is something that's really sort of fallen out of style in Australia over the decades. If you go back to, the 40s and the 50s, it was still really strong, but maybe from the 60s onwards, it's on a gradual decline. It's just really not a thing now. In fact, it's really quite different the way some Brits approach radio plays, whereas the average Australian would have never heard one, I would suggest. Anyway, over to you, Mike.
Yeah, and in the USA, very similar. It's an oddity. You might hear like a PBS type station, audio station play, an occasional audio play or something like that, but extremely rare. It's really just with the advent of podcast stuff and Audible really jumping into the dramatization field that we've seen anything like that starting to go on. You're seeing more Hollywood celebrities jump at the opportunity. I think they're hearing that they view it as an easy day at the office, not realizing all the intricacies that go into radio acting or voice acting. So it's not always the best outcome, but yeah, just something we definitely don't have in the US. I also, TV series wasn't for me. One interesting thing I'll note, you mentioned Sandra Dickinson not ending up being the big thing. Can't speak to that, but one thing I'll say is that Sandra Dickinson maybe wasn't my favorite Trillian when it comes to TV, but there's some very interesting stuff that happens when she gets incorporated into the audio series along with the original actress who played Trillian. So without saying too much, there's 2 Trillians. And the version she plays actually works very well for her type of performance. So interesting stuff.
Ooh, that's a teaser.
Yeah, there you go. So
many decades in the making.
One more reason to go and check it out.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. Well, Nemo Thorks via YouTube says, I love to hear folks unapologetically enjoying Hitchhikers. I don't know why anybody would ever apologetically enjoy it, but that's unfortunate to hear, and I'm thankful that you enjoyed hearing us enjoy it. So, some thoughts. Zaphod's chill, which doesn't quite land. that is kind of the point of the character. And I should mention that Zaphod's chill is kind of a quote from what you had all mentioned, which doesn't quite land. That's the point of the character. He wants to be cool and chill and relaxed, but he's got too much manic energy to actually pull it off. Model effects being dated. They are. But as far as I know, they weren't done by the BBC department with the experience of having done Doctor Who. So that's interesting. Doctor Who had some effects during that era that was really interesting, and maybe some effects that were still pretty dodgy.
I think it came down to the individual involved. Like a Mike Tucker might do something very well, but someone else might not.
Exactly. He also goes on to mention Slartibart Fast air car. It was a tunnel that they wanted the lights turned off for, but couldn't get that done. So the reflections were an unintended result, but a welcome one. Episode 6 length. He says as far as he knows, it's not the short version you were familiar with, which was cut down from the original, but that the more recent releases, possibly since the 90s official release, have extended edits compared to the original broadcasts. And those are always tricky things to find out, especially as, a lot of that documentation and magazine article type stuff that would have really gone into it's probably fallen by the wayside over the years.
Yeah, but certainly Dave remembered seeing it on the ABC or seeing the video of it that had been recorded from the ABC. And then when he got to this disc, there was so much more in it. And that quite amazed him, yeah.
That's always so fascinating to have your memories upended like that. And I think we've all had that happen at times.
Yeah.
He mentions regarding fans' demographics, I think it's complicated. It's a very wide fan base. So many people know of it and have fond memories, but a very narrow fandom. The folks who actually chat on the fan subreddits, discords, fan clubs, and comments on the YouTube videos such as this. Overall, it's an aging fan base, but the Discord definitely leans younger, so there's potential for more.
Wow.
Yeah, that's exciting. I mean, my car is named Random Frequent Flyer Dent after Arthur's daughter. I consider myself a Hitchhiker fan, but it's not a fandom I actively engage with either. So,
same.
I think with the lack of additional material after those, you've got the 6 books and the various versions, but it's not something where there's ongoing stories being presented where there's new things to discuss. That kind of makes it difficult.
Or someone will say to me, it was Towel Day last Wednesday. And I'll be like, oh, okay, I've missed it for another year.
Yeah, I try to repost an image, but if I miss it, I miss it. So again, it's not that I don't love and appreciate Hitchhiker. I bought the first novel for my 12-year-old nephew, or he was 12 at the time. I still need to talk to him more and see what he thought about it. But I'm glad it's there. I'm glad it exists, and I hope that more fandom does continue to grow and appreciate it over the years, regardless of which format it's in.
Nice.
And then the last item here mentions as far as remake, tone, etc. Could non-Brits make it? I've watched 30 Rock from the Sun a few years back and found it at its best, it struck the same funny bone for me as Hitchhikers does. So I'd say that yes, with the right writers, it could be successful as a US production.
Interesting. I know people on both sides of that equation. People who say, no, it never can be American. And others who say, well, like Dylan was saying on the show, if you want to reach a big audience, it might have to be.
Yeah. I think you have to find someone who really understands that tone that Douglas Adams was trying to accomplish. And you also have to have somebody who is willing to put their own voice to it. Someone who's willing to do something, and I appreciate with what I've seen of the film. I mean, they did try to do something that was not just a carbon copy, but I think just landing that tone is a very difficult thing to manage. So you're going to have to find somebody who maybe is more a little bit of an out there creator, not quite a David Lynch out there, but, just someone who's a little out there though.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much to everyone who wrote to us by email, by our website, by X, by Blue Sky, Facebook. If you'd ever like to chat with us, please drop us a line. Now, we'll move into what have we been watching. Mike, I've been watching a few things of late. I finished my West Wing watch, some time back now, actually. I basically did all 7 seasons of The West Wing in a month and a bit, and I found it really good, as you can tell by how quickly I watched it. A few things happened in the last season that I might not have done, but broadly I was entertained start to finish. I've rewatched Generation Kill, which is a mini-series based on a book by a Rolling Stone writer who was embedded with some Marines during the invasion of Iraq in 2003. I think it's really good. It's raw as hell, but it's not over sentimentalized or dramatized. It feels to me what riding around with these guys in their Humvee would have actually been like, for better or worse. I watched The Recruit on Netflix, which is a dramedy about a young guy who's new to being a CIA lawyer, but keeps ending up out in the field, having these James Bond type adventures, even though he has zero training for that kind of thing. And I was halfway through that, and I heard that Netflix had cancelled it, so great.
Geez.
Thank you, Netflix. And finally, Ludwig. I finally got to see it at long last. It came out in the UK late last year, I think. David Mitchell playing a guy pretending to be his twin brother. The brother is a detective who's gone missing, and Mitchell steps into his shoes to try and help find him. So he's pretending to be a police detective when he's not. It's really funny. It's your basic whodunit type British show, and I liked it a lot. That's me.
So lots of shows about people trying to figure it out without actually having a plan. Got it.
Yes, actually.
A couple of questions for you. West Wing, most of those are 20-plus episode seasons, right?
Yes.
So yeah, this isn't like some modern 8-episode, 10-episode thing you sped run. You did like 140, 150 episodes of this series. So that's really impressive in the time frame you watched it in.
I did, but when you think the episodes are like 45, 50 minutes, you can do 2 to 3 in a day most days, and on weekends you can really push the boat out and maybe do 4, 5, 6. And so when you're starting to do those kinds of numbers day to day, a month and a half is all you need.
Yeah, very easy to fall into the one more episode trap with that.
Oh yeah, it's very watchable.
And I would also ask, you mentioned Generation Kill, and one of the producers, writers of the series was David Simon, who also did The Wire, and he's done dozens of other projects. I mean, I don't know about dozens, but lots of other projects. Are you very familiar with the rest of his body of work, or any of his body of work?
I'm not, and that's to my eternal shame, because so many people over the years have said, you should watch The Wire, you would really love The Wire. And I think it's one of those things where the more people who tell me I should watch The Wire, the less I watch The Wire.
No, understandable, and it's become a cliche. Now, I can say I'm double cliche because I watched it while it was airing. But,
right.
There's all these people who swear by it's the greatest TV show ever. I don't know if that's true or not. I think it's a tremendous TV show. But really what I would mention here is almost all of David Simon's works that he's done, going back to Homicide: Life on the Streets, they're very much about the way that organizations operate, whether it be a police organization, whether it be a government body, an army platoon, or even a drug organization. It's about the inefficiencies and just the way that personal politics and things like that mess things up or make things more complicated than they should have to be. And at times it's a very dim view of the world, but it's also done in a very mature manner. There's a particular story series I would recommend. It's only about 6 or 8 episodes. It was recent. It's called We Own This City. It stars John Barenthal, who is, of course, the Punisher for Marvel, as well as a lot of other films he's been in lately. But it's about a particular squad in Baltimore, a police squad, who are given tremendous amount of liberty to police as they see efficient or effective, and how this really undermined and destroyed the credibility of the department in the city.
Oh, wow. So it's like true story.
True story, yeah.
Right.
Much of his work is... The other thing I would recommend is there's a book he wrote, and this is back about 1987, 88. It's called Homicide: A Year on the Killing Streets, where he spent a year embedded with the Baltimore Police Homicide Unit. And it's telling the stories about how these men investigated crimes, who they were, how they approached their work. So it was one of the first things that really approached police work as a human sort of thing. And it's not just like this Columbo, Kojak, they miraculously crack the code or whatever. It's not like that. It's about diligence and intelligence and just really a personal perseverance. I switched my major to criminal justice after I read that book. Wow. And I only ended up minoring in criminal justice. I went back to English, but right. I highly recommend for folks who've not checked out his work. It doesn't have to be The Wire, but there's a few mini series he's done over the years. David Simon's work is tremendous, and I will quit babbling about it.
No, that's a really good suggestion there. I'll definitely look into the Baltimore story you mentioned there. That sounds very good.
Yeah, absolutely. So,
What have you been watching, Mike?
Yellow Jackets is back for season 3. Yellow Jackets is a series about, it's set in, I believe, 1996 or 7, and it's about a girls' soccer team, a high school girls' soccer team that crashes when they're on their way to a tournament. They're out in the middle of the woods. They have to figure out how to survive. Nobody is able to find them. We don't know how long they're going to go out there. We just know that some really bad, awful stuff is going to happen while they're out there. What's interesting is this series also takes place in the modern day. So we see a few of these characters who now we know survived the experience, for better or worse. And we get mystery between the two eras as far as what happened, who did what. And you realize that these characters you've been rooting for maybe aren't the best characters. Very challenging in that regard. There's hints of the supernatural, but it's always done in a way that you can explain it either way. It's coincidence or it is actually something supernatural occurring. So very much like a horror drama type show. Great performances, great acting. Just really enjoy that one quite a bit. I've been catching up on Fargo, which is a kind of a crime anthology based off of the film from the 90s. It takes place in and around Fargo, North Dakota, so kind of more like farmland, not big city USA. And it's about people who get wrapped up in crimes. Each season's a different story that takes place in the area, but it takes place in a different decade potentially. So you might see characters overlap from story to story, but it's that anthology kind of thing where, each one's a little bit different. And finally, even though I know it's been a couple months, Cobra Kai, of course, they landed the ending.
Yes.
I was at the Gallifrey One convention, could not sleep the Thursday night before the convention. So I'm in my hotel room watching the final season on my phone, intended to watch 2 or 3 episodes that had dropped that day. And I stayed up the entire night watching the full last drop of the season.
On your phone?
On my phone. Just laying in bed. Did you have eye strain? In my phone in the dark. Sorry, what's that?
Did you have eye strain?
No, I was okay.
Okay.
But it was just, it was a really tremendous ending to the series. And as you've said before, I think that a lot of screenwriters should be looking at that series and seeing how to use it as a template for what they would want to do, particularly in playing with time limits, not feeling married to the idea that a drama series has to be 50 or 52 minutes or what have you, that you can do a 30-minute episode, hit all the high points, and still be really engaging and entertaining. And just the way to develop all these different characters in an ensemble. And even though some of them are goofy, some of them are serious, but to land emotional beats on an ongoing basis, I think that for a show that's very goofy, it's really a tremendous achievement.
Even from the point of view of modern reinterpretations of old properties, they often just try and make a joke of the old stuff. And certainly Johnny Lawrence in the first season is presented as a joke, like his life's gone nowhere or whatever. But by the end of it, he's the hero of the show. He's one of the heroes of the show. There are many heroes by the end of Cobra Kai.
Yeah, you definitely see these characters develop, and most of the characters have some dark moments as well as some light moments. So it's good in showing that nobody's ever perfect or nobody's ever always the good guy. That's really great storytelling. I appreciate that. So one other thing I'll just mention real quick, as far as not so much watching as listening, is a couple of friends who run the Girlies for McGann podcast. It's a podcast about Paul McGann and his work, not just specifically Doctor Who. They cover films, television projects, just different things he's been a part of over the years. 8 months in, they managed to score an interview through hard work and networking. They got an interview with Paul McGann. And over 2 parts, over their recent podcast, they did a 3-hour interview with Paul McGann. And a lot of it is not related to Doctor Who. It's just more about his life, his interests. He's a big fan of silent films. He's a big fan of war, not reenactment, but just visiting sites where wars happen and studying what happened in wars and different historical events. So it's very fascinating to learn more about the man behind the actor. So, if you get a chance, I think it's on YouTube as well as Spotify and a few other things. So give that a listen.
Girlies for McGann.
Yeah, indeed. They understood the assignment when they picked that title. So I appreciate it.
They sure did. Very good. Look, thank you so much, Mike, for taking time out of your weekend to come on and host with me. It's really appreciated. And if listeners want to say hello to you, where can they best do that?
So if folks want to find me online, they can find me on Blue Sky primarily at MASOLKO. That's at Solko. I'm also on Instagram. I have some projects in the pipeline, nothing ready to announce yet, but those are the two avenues you'll most likely see me announcing anything. So trying to get back, dip my toes in the podcasting game a little bit, get back to being the Pip and Jane of podcasting. If you need somebody on short notice to do an overly verbose job at a mediocre level, I'm your guy.
Yeah, great rates. So next time, folks, no surprises. We'll be looking at the 8th Doctor adventure Father Time by Lance Parkin. If that sounds like your cup of tea, join Dave and I next month for that one. But until then, I've been Rob.
And I've been Mike.
And we'll see you next time on The Doctor Who Show. You've been listening to
The Doctor Who Show with Rob and Dave.
Find us online by searching for
The Doctor Who Show.
We also love it when you write in. Drop us a line anytime at hello@thedwshow.net.
And one other last thing I'll just mention real quick, just kind of a shout. Thanks, guys.
That's an edit.